Hi everyone, my name is Shazia Khan and the unit we'll be doing today is Unit 7, which is the legal research methods. So the element we're going to be doing today is looking at assignment discussion. So we've looked at learning outcome 1 to 5, and then we're going to go through the assignment discussion. So before we go through the assignment discussion, I want to just reiterate what we've done in each learning outcome. So just a summary of what we've done in the learning outcomes and what is expected of you in the assignment then as well. So firstly, we're going to go through learning outcome 1, a quick summary of what we've done. And learning outcome 1 was looking at understanding how to conduct legal research. Why legal research is so important? You know, the whole point of having legal research is develop your skills, get you to look at different problems and how to identify them, but how to relate to conducting things like, referencing your literature review and, trying to look at your data as well. So looking at learning outcome 1, we looked at the doctrinal research, which is research in the law, the jury, issues and criteria to conduct a legal research, exploring decision making of magistrates and juries, looking at social legal studies, ethical dimensions. We also focused on case law and statutes and other legal sources. We looked at the black letter and where the law has come from, a set of principles. We looked at the element of what legal research is, the criteria for legal research and the key issues around legal research. We looked at social legal studies, research methods and ethical dimensions. We also looked at the black letter approach, which I just mentioned earlier as well, doctoral research and informed consent. We looked at the legal research strategy and why that's so important in regards to doing any sort of research, because the main element around doing any sort of research, be it legal or not, is that it's the most important element of the research. So it's the cornerstone of everything. It's a way of analysing, identifying, accessing, interpreting legal sources, sources like, for example, it could be things like, England law journals. It could be things like articles, scholarly articles. It could be case laws, and looking at them to look at unraveling any sort of complexities or looking at any sort of inquiries into what the law is about. And especially on an academic piece of work or in an academic and professional context, you need to know the legal research around it, because you need to be analytical. You need to be able to navigate any sort of legal landscapes, any gaps in the law, and also look at any sort of reasoning around that. You need to analyze, that's really important. You need to interpret, and you need to be looking at legal research from an evidence-based decision-making, where look at regulations, look at legislation, and look at societal norms and public interest, because that's an element that needs to be discussed when looking at any sort of legal research methods. Again, the criteria for effective legal research, things like, clarity of research objectives. So you need to have, you need to be clear. A plan needs to be put in place so you've got clarity of your objectives. So you need to have a roadmap from start to finish, what you intend to do, what your focus is on, and what your purpose is. Thoroughness of your research, and that would be things like, whether the what kind of sources you will use, whether they are secondary sources, primary sources, and whether they are credible sources as well. And that's coming on to the next one, which is relevance of sources, credibility, reliability, validity, and whether they're authentic as well, because it's really important within the legal side of it that the sources you use are authentic. Because if you've got to submit an argument within court, you need to say that, this piece of evidence is authentic, rather than taking something off Wikipedia and saying, because people can add to Wikipedia. Accuracy of analysis. So You need to be analytic and use methodologies that would help your critical thinking, but also evaluate any sort of legal resources. Effectiveness of communication, so you need to be concise. You need to tailor the communication around your audience. We also looked at, in Learning Outcome 1, key issues in legal research. So, things that may hinder you from doing anything. There could be lots of complexities out there. We also looked at the importance of identifying key issues, things like focusing efforts. Identification of key issues facilitates efficient formulating research questions, and that's really important at the start of it to do that, so you meet your objectives. We also looked at diversity of research methodologies in socio-legal studies, and we looked at the exploration of research methods used. So you could use, again, qualitative, quantitative approaches, and how you would research them, but how that would be in regards to your social norms and things and what you would need to do. We looked at qualitative research methods, which is things like observations, case studies, and then quantitative methods, which is more numerical data. Examples of research methods in social legal studies can be things like ethnographical research, content research, critical legal research, and comparative legal research. We then went on to look at the black letter approach to doctoral legal research and how that focuses on examining analysis of primary legal research, such as case law, statutes. And we then went on to look at how important case law, statutes, and legal sources are within the black letter approach. We looked at the features of the doctrinal approach research, which is, how to explore things, methods, a diverse analysis. We looked at case analysis, statutory interpretation, and looked at examples of doctrinal research, studies of judicial reasoning, investigation of legislative intent, comparative legal studies. And then we looked at the importance in regards to using different sorts of methodologies. So that is Learning Outcome 1. We then went on to look at Learning Outcome 2, which looked at being able to develop legal research approaches. We went on to look at in the key terminology, which was the SMART objective. We went on to look at research methods, so things like mixed methods, quantitative research, which we mentioned earlier, qualitative research, sampling, data collections. We looked at, again, the importance of legal research and its approaches. Structured framework for selecting research. So here, look at how you want to select your research, what topic you want to look at, whether it's timely, whether there's enough resources out there to select your topic. You need to be, it's quite important. It needs to be a topic that's interesting for you. We looked at importance of legal research, things like advancing your knowledge, informing decision-making, addressing any sort of legal challenges, academic pursuits, professional practice, and policy development. We went to then look at choosing a relevant research topic. Again, I said that, it's really important. It's critical in ensuring that you've chosen the right topic so that you're able to research around that topic. And there's several factors that can be considered, things like, choosing the research topic, including whether it's relevant. That's really important, whether there's a relevance to the area of law, societal importance, and that would be things like, if there's any sort of pressing issues within media or any sort of legal issues within the society that you could use. Contribution to existing knowledge, so, you should offer, researchers should, and this is where the researcher should be doing a good literature review to identify any sort of current debates or any sort of controversies. So it's really important. We also looked at creating aims and objectives, and we did this with using the SMART criteria, which is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And we looked at research aims and why it's so important to establish clear research aims and objectives. We looked at the detailed plan for research project, why a plan is so important. And like we said, it's a roadmap. It's there for you to start at the end of it, from the start to the finish. We looked at research methodology. So what you'll be using, mixed method approaches, qualitative, quantitative, empirical studies, data collection methods, analysis techniques. We also looked at things like, dissemination strategies, what strategies you would use to help you in regards to this, and whether, you are adhering to the framework of the SMART acronym, and considering your rationale for selecting this area. So here is where you need to obviously produce your literature review as well. So that is learning outcome 1. Learning outcome 2. We then went on to learning outcome 3, which is to be able to critically review literature relevant to a legal topic. And this is where you will be producing a literature review. Okay, so we looked at different elements of a literature review. We looked at some areas that you can consider for research, things like, there may be areas such as cybercrime. You may look at things like international trade law, climate change in international law, maybe the impact of the laws in regard to trade. We then went on to look at critically analysing different theoretical approaches to a legal research problem, which is 3.1. We looked at ethical aspects, also why it's so important in your research project. We then went on to look at the evaluation of arguments. We went on to look at 3.2, which is a clear creating a structured and thorough critical review, literature review. And this is part of your assignment as well. It needs to investigate a critical review, literature review, and it needs to look at your resources. So it's easier, makes it easier to identify any sort of research gaps as well. And we also looked at the importance of a literature review when it establishes any sort of paper. So it kind of detects any sort of flaws in identifying research gaps, transforms the conclusion into primary research. We then went on to look at a literature review. So what a literature review contains, it provides an overview of any sort of current knowledge, allowing you to identify theories, methods, as we mentioned, gaps in the existing research that you want to kind of look at. 5 steps to writing a good literature review: search for relevant literature. We looked at evaluate your sources, identify any sort of themes as well. We also looked at outlining the structure and writing your literature review. We looked at how it's so important that it analyzes, synthesizes, and critically evaluates to give a clear picture. We also looked, and I put some links on learning outcome 3 in regards to examples of literature review, and it was different sorts of examples that could give you an idea of doing a literature review. And there were some links there that you could go on to in regards to doing them. So it gives you an idea of why to do the literature review and why a literature review is so important. And that is one part of your assignment that you need to consider. So that is learning outcome 3. We then went on to look at learning outcome 4. And this was to be able to design a legal research methodologies. So we looked at what legal research is. So it's aimed at, being able to observe your skills and research legally. So definitions of law, case studies, and regulations. We looked at research methodologies. We looked at 4.1, which was to critically evaluate relevant research methodologies that can be applied to your research area. So we looked at why it's so important to conduct research. We also looked at what a research methodology is, and we looked at the ways to test sufficiency, reliability, and validity of research. Why it's so important that we measure this, because we need to make sure that the information is accurate and valid as well. That's really important. We also looked at reliability and validity in doing a research paper. So we looked at different sections of a thesis, so literature review, methodology, results, and discussion and conclusion. We looked at 4.2, which we looked at justifying the methodology selected in terms of the research. You need to be quite selective on what you want to do and what meets your legal research project. You cannot just do a quantitative one or a qualitative if it doesn't meet what you want to do. So you need to be selective. So, we looked at primary and secondary research. Things like primary would be surveys or observations, and secondary would be things academically from researchers, such as academic journals, government agencies or national statistics. We then went on to look at literature review with reference to secondary research methods. We then went on to 4.3, which was looking at proposing suitable techniques to use with quantitative and qualitative data collection and analysis. So we looked at what qualitative data is and what quantitative data is. As we mentioned earlier, quantitative data research collects numerical data, and the main aim of it is to produce empirical data that can be measured against numerical data. And then qualitative data, on the other hand, collects non-numerical data, such as things like words, images, and sounds. We looked at quantitative and qualitative data collection and how important that is, and how it helps to use the data collection to answer your research question, why it's so helpful. Things like using observations, things like using case studies, interviews, so why they are important in regards to it. We looked at the data analysis methods such as qualitative content analysis, thematical analysis, discourse analysis, and narrative analysis, imperative analysis, and visual analysis, and the importance of each one, why they're relevant. We also looked at qualitative data collection methods such as interviews, so asking things like open-ended questions. We looked at focus groups, so discussion among a group of people and, around the topic area. Ethnography, like participating in a community, and literature review. We also looked at the difference between literature search and a review and why that is so important. So literature search, although they are related, a literature search is the process of seeking out and identifying the existing literature, while a literature review is an organized synthesis of information found in the existing literature. So it's really important that we're able to identify where we're getting the information from and also look at the difference between each one. We also looked at different ways to reference sources. So, there are different ways to reference the sources. So Harvard referencing system is the most common one used in a lot of universities in the UK, where you'd have your referencing and you would have your element of a citation within the text, why it's so important in regards to that. And we also looked at, how you'd fully reference things towards the end. And then finally, in research learning outcome 4, we looked at why research methodology is so important in doing your research. We then went on to look at learning outcome 5, which is the final learning outcome before we discussed the assignment discussion, and that was being able to plan and prepare legal research project. We looked at why it's important to plan a legal research, why planning is so important, and it is one of the most important stages of preparing a legal research project. We looked at a research report on what should be included, things like, title page, acknowledgements, contents page, introduction. We also looked at the summary of literature review that is needed within that, research methods used, findings, recommendations, references, and bibliography. We looked at the SWOT analysis in regards to your own research goals and how that would help in preparing a research plan. We looked at 5.1, which was to plan a legal research project and present this as a written proposal. So a plan, again, it's one of the main elements of a research project, why it's so important to plan. Questions, also some things to consider in your research, things like what is the general theoretical area in which you are doing your specific area? What are the specific objectives? We looked at doing a written proposal, and I put a video on there as well to look at how to do a written proposal and why it's so important. And I gave you some examples as well that you could look at in regards to, there were links on there on research proposal on page 11. We also looked at more in detail on ways to test sufficiency, reliability and validity of your research and why it's so important. We then went on to 5.2, which was to critically evaluate your own skills and knowledge with reference to intended outcome of the research project. We looked at quality issues, why it's so important to look at scrutinizing the information, but also why it's important to be more professional, transparent, and audible. We looked at the ethical principle, and that's a really important principle in regards to understanding real-life phenomena, considering protecting individuals' rights, enhancing research validity, and maintaining any sort of integrity within your audience. We looked at the principle of confidentiality in research and why it's so important that you remove any identifying information from the report to protect any sort of personal data, and that you keep the person anonymous. We looked at the data security principle in research. We also looked at reflecting on our own research goals, such as SWOT analysis, our strengths, looking at our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats in a project, and how it's so important in specifying this. We looked at the SWOT analysis in a research paper. So it identifies a framework and analyzes our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And we looked at an example of a SWOT analysis as well, and how that would help in regards to students. We also looked at things like the qualities that make a good researcher. And we looked at why it's so important in conducting a SWOT analysis. So you're able to understand the factors that will help you gain any sort of valuable insights into research, and how the SWOT analysis will help you align your goals. So we've done learning outcome, a summary of learning outcome 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now we're going to go into the assignment discussion, which will look at implementing all these learning outcomes to help you complete the assignment. So we're going to go into the assignment discussion. So the aim of the unit is to allow learners to develop knowledge and understanding of skills relating to legal research and theoretical and methodological problems associated with legal studies. You've got to look at research problems, conducting literature, referencing, data collection, and so on. What information needs to go on the assignment? Okay, so you need to include the following. Your registration, your name is the most important thing on it. Registration number, your unit level, which in this case is level 7, and the unit you're doing is legal research methods. Assignment declaration, and this is really important in regards to submitting this. This will identify if there's any sort of issues in regard to when you have done this assignment, that you haven't plagiarized any work, that you are submitting the assignment knowing that you haven't plagiarized any work, and you haven't cheated or colluded, because that is part of the policies. You need to make sure that the work you are submitting is your work. It's very important. And this is a declaration that you need to sign to identify that the work is your own work. and you have used electronic sources and you've referenced your sources, and that it will be going through a software that will detect any sort of collusion or plagiarism, and then that would be, you know, it will be an element of malpractice, and it would need to be investigated. So you need to make sure that your work that you do, you need to make sure that you reference it and it's not plagiarized, and there's no cheating or any form of collusion going on. So you need to make sure the work you submit is your work with your referencing, and it is submitted with reference to the policy requirements of the awarding body. So the start of the assignment, you need to include the following: table of contents. And that's really important because you need to be able to, if the person is going through everything, they need to be able to identify that they know what they're referring to and where it is. Font size 12, 1.5 line spacing. It needs to have page numbers to be inserted. So it's clear on the contents page which page you've done the work. An introduction, and make sure you are putting all your assessment criteria AC in headings. So make sure you are doing headings. Headings are so important in regards to doing your work. Avoid using bullet points or anything like that. It needs to be an academic piece of work. And also make sure you are using headings that are the same as what you are expected to do. So look at the feedback sheet and look at the criteria that you must follow and put that as a heading. If you are doing the merit criteria or distinction criteria, make sure you are covering that as well. Learning outcomes. So as we mentioned, like I've been through the 5 learning outcomes, summarize them. These are just an overview and just something to remind you. Again, learning outcome 1 was to understand how to conduct legal research. Learning outcome 2 was to be able to develop legal research approaches. Learning outcome 3 was to be able to critically review literature relevant to your legal topic. Learning outcome 4 was to be able to design a legal research methodology, and learning outcome 5 was to be able to plan and prepare a legal research project. So starting on the tasks now. This is task 1 of 3. So there are 3 tasks that you need to do, and we are looking at task 1 first. So task 1, unit learning outcomes 1. So the first one is to understand how to conduct legal research, and that is part of task 1. Assignment brief and guidance, task 1 of 3. So legal research is the process of identifying and retrieving information necessary to support legal decision making. Produce a report which focuses on how to conduct legal research. You must ensure that your report looks at the following. So it identifies the criteria required to conduct legal research. So what you would do for the first one is you would have that as your heading, and you would write everything under that heading, okay, that answers that question, okay? So literally answers that part of the report, number 1, you need to write everything underneath and make it clear that you've done it. Part 2 is to define key issues in the proposed research. Number 3 is to assess the diversity of research methods using socio-legal studies. Part 4 is to evaluate ethical dimensions of socio-legal approaches. And then part 5 is to analyse these features of the black letter approach to doctoral research. You need to do each one of these. So there's 5 parts of task 1. You need to do each one of these to answer the question. And then once that's a heading, you will write under that as the answer, okay? So each one has a different part to it. Here you must show, learners must show, so you must show a knowledge and understanding of the subject area, because that's really important. You should be able to understand the subject area after doing all the 5 learning outcomes. You must provide references to relevant case law. It's so important to reference your work and your legislation wherever appropriate, because you need to be able to identify that you've got your research from here or from there, and you know it's viable research, reliable sources, and you know the sources are valid as well. It's really important you are able to reference your sources. Another really important one is that you must be able to support answers and show evidence of wider reading appropriately. So if it asks you something, do this or analyze that or describe something, make sure you are giving examples, be it any examples outside, or it could be a day-to-day example, or it could be a case example. So make sure your answers are supported by evidence. It's really important to show that you are thinking outside the box, like they say, because you need to be showing that you have wider reading and you are approaching things like journal articles to identify certain elements. Delivery and submission. So this part of the assignment, because there's 5 parts to it, the submission is in the form of a report written in the Word format. The recommended word limit is 500 words, excluding diagrams, references, and appendices. Learners are expected to adhere to the word count, and there's a 10% leeway either side of this range is permitted before the assessor is instructed to stop reading any further. So it's 500 words. Okay, so if we go back to your task, you've got 5 parts. So what you'll do is you'll do 100 words for each part. Because it's 500 words, you will do 100 words, and there's 5 parts to your report. First one, identifying the criteria required to conduct legal research, which we'll do 100 words for. Part 2, which defines key issues in the proposed research, 100 words. Another, assesses the diversity of research method used in social legal studies, 100 words. Evaluates ethical dimensions of social legal approaches, 100 words, and analyzes features of black letter approach, another 100 words. You have, like they said, you will have a 10% leeway at either side. So that on the 10% is on 500 words is 50 words. Okay, so you would have that leeway to help you before they stop reading. So make sure you are prioritizing and making sure that your time is in regards to the word limit. Make sure you stick to that word limit. Where to find the information for task 1 of 3. So task assessment criteria to be covered here is you're using learning outcome 1 mainly for all the answers. 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, and 1.5. And that is in learning outcome 1 to cover task 1. We've given you an example. So I've pulled out a question from task 1 and where you can find that question, the answer to that question. So I just pulled out one. So the first one I pulled out was assesses the diversity of research methods used in social legal studies. And where you would find this on the slides, on the PowerPoint slides, you would find it in Learning Outcome 1 slides, and it's from page 21 onwards. So this gives you a little bit of an idea what you need to look at for that bit of the area. So you need to make sure everything that you cover in task 1 of the 3 tasks is in Learning Outcome 1. Hope that helps. If there's any questions, you can email me. Now we'll move on to task 2, task 2 of 3. So the unit learning outcomes to be used for task 2 are learning outcomes 2 and 3. So learning outcome 2 is to be able to develop legal research approaches, and learning outcome 3 is to be able to critically review literature relevant to a legal topic. So the assignment brief and guidance for task 2 of 3 is the next one. Based on a legal research area of your choice, produce a literature review using a recognized and accepted convention. You must ensure that the review critically analyzes different theoretical approaches to a legal research problem. The literature review should be presented in a logical and constructed format based on the following recommendations. So you must here do a literature review, and you will be using learning outcome 2 and 3 for this. So your literature review must include, this is a recommended format, so it must have the purpose, objectives of your literature review. It must have a search of the relevant literature which is being used. You must have an evaluation of sources and any data research methods used, quantitative, qualitative, primary, secondary, things like maybe interviews, observations, surveys, things like that. Identification of themes, debates, and gaps. Evaluation of arguments and ethical aspects and conclusions. And we've looked at this in regards to, I've given you on part 2 and 3 examples of literature review that you can look at in your own time that would give you guidance as well. All comments and statements in your literature review need to be factually sound, backed up by research and implementation results from reliable sources. And that's important. They have to be valid, reliable sources rather than sources you just pick off or anything you get from Wikipedia, which you can add on to. Remember, that is not a reliable source. And it must provide an adequate review of your topic under study. Learners, again, must show knowledge and understanding of the subject area. You must be able to provide references to relevant case law and/or legislation wherever appropriate. You must be able to support answers and show evidence, again, of wider reading. Delivery and submission. So for this part of the literature review, because it's in the form of a literature review, you have to produce a literature review written in the form of Word format. So it's a Word document. The recommended word limit for task 2 for the literature review is 1,000 words, excluding any sort of diagrams, references, and any sort of appendices. So you need to make sure that you are sticking to the 1,000 words limit. Learners are expected, again, like I said, to adhere to the word count. And you need to make sure that there's a 10% leeway either side of this range to permitted before the assessor, again, is instructed to stop reading any further. Where to find the information for task 2 of 3. It must be in task 2.1. So it's learning outcome 1 and 2. So 2.1, 3.1, and 3.2. This is where you will be doing the literature review in task 2. Examples of something that you would be able to do in task 2 of it is looking at things like ethical issues. And that would be on learning outcome 3 slides, page numbers 5 onwards, where you'd find the answer for ethical issues. Now moving on to task 3 of 3, and this unit learning outcomes 4. So here you would look at learning outcome 2, 5, 4, and 5. So be able to develop research approaches. Learning outcome 4, be able to design illegal research methodologies, and learning outcome 5, being able to plan and prepare a research project. So the assignment brief is task 3, and the guidance of this is task 3 of 3. So we've gone through task 1 and 2, and this is the final task. Building on your literature review from task 2. So you've produced a literature review in task 2. Produce a legal research proposal. You must ensure that the proposal has these elements on it. So number 1, contains appropriate and justified research aims and objectives. And as we looked at aims and objectives, they are really, really important to any research proposal, and because it identifies what you want to do, what you want to focus on, what your aim is, and where you want to achieve these aims and objectives. Number 2, contains a detailed plan for the research project. Number 3, critically evaluates relevant research methodologies that can be applied to your chosen research topic. Number 4, it justifies the methodology selected in terms of the research. Then we carry on. Number 5, it proposes suitable techniques to use with quantitative and qualitative data collection and analysis. So we looked at in learning outcome 4, 5, we looked at qualitative data. Throughout the learning outcomes, we looked at the importance of using qualitative data and why they're so important in any sort of research. So you could look at things, in regards to that, in what you would do in regards to having used qualitative and quantitative data, what kind of data you would use, why you want to use that data, and why it's so important for you to identify using that data. You need to also indicate, number 6 indicates you understand a range of different methodological approaches to understanding a legal issue. you need to make sure you are looking at different methods for using different approaches to use to understand legal issues. You also, number 7, need to consider the implications of proposed research, including ethical, confidentiality and data security. And we looked at that. We looked at the importance of confidentiality, why there's a need to have confidentiality, why there's a need to have ethics in place, why there's a need to make sure that your research is sufficient, valid, you know, and why quality issues are such an important part of it. Things like, you know, that was learning outcome 5, where we'd look at things like, you know, ethical issues. There must be professionalism, there must be transparency, accountability, you know, why it's important to take ethical issues into account if you're looking at protecting the research, you know, the rights of the research participants, why there's a need to do that, why there's a need to allow privacy for all participants, you know, so you protect their personal data and, you know, that is anonymous as well. You know, you maintain that confidentiality and to build that trust between the researcher and the participant. So that's, and why data security is so important. Any sort of safeguards that you need to put in place, any sort of physical security, things like maybe a code, you know, safeguards, you know, privacy, any sort of codes or PIN numbers or passwords to identify that you've put in place any sort of data security. And then the final one, number 8, contains an evaluation of one's own suitability as a researcher, why it's so important that you are suitable to be a researcher. So this is task 3 of 3, and the delivery and submission is in the form of a legal research proposal written in a Word format. Okay, the recommended word limit, and this is the highest of both tasks, task 1 and task 2, this is 2,500 words. So it's quite a lot to cover, but it's a lot of words for you to cover as well, excluding diagrams, references, and appendices. And you are expected to adhere to the word count, okay? So make sure you don't go too much over and too under as well. 10% leeway either way, either side of this range is permitted before the assessor is actually instructed to stop reading any further. So this is what you need to be doing for task 3 in regards to trying to meet the requirements of that. Where to find information for task 3 of 3, task assessment criteria to be covered. So you are covering learning outcome 1, learning outcome 2, 2.2, 2.3 to cover this task, learning outcome 4, 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, and then learning outcome 5, 5.1 and 5.2. And this will cover task 3 of 3. Example question that I've taken out of task 3 to look at is, firstly, critically evaluate relevant research methodologies that can be applied to your chosen research topic. So I just picked out a bit of that, them elements, and for task 3, and see where you can find them. And for that, you would be looking at learning outcome 4 on pages 6 onwards. So you would be looking at identifying any sort of methodologies, but they would be on learning outcome 4, page 6 onwards. So this is where to find the information. So we've gone through all the learning outcomes, all the tasks that you need to do. So there's 3 tasks. You need to make sure that you are referencing all 3 tasks, and that is really, really important that you are sticking to, if you use and cite case law, you need to fully cite them, any sort of academic sources, journals, articles, and any sort of reliable sources. Make sure you are referencing all your sources. And as we said, most universities, most institutions use the comprehensive Harvard-style referencing list, which must be included at the end of the work. There's a lot of online resources that would help you make the reference if you struggle to put where the dots and the commas are. And an example of that, which I've used throughout, is Neil's Toolbox, which you can go on to, which would help you, you know, reference your work properly, whether it be a website, whether it be a journal, whether it be something from a book. It will show you how to reference. End of the assignment, so make sure you do a conclusion. And that concludes the whole assignment. So it's really important you make sure you do a conclusion. Make sure you provide a reference list and a bibliography, one or the other. And the reasoning behind that is you need to identify the sources that you've used. Make sure you are referencing them. Make sure you are looking at, again, credible sources, valid sources. Make sure you are looking at sources that you have used towards doing either your literature review or answering any of the 3 tasks that we've gone through. So you need to make sure you are, again, I'm going to go through this and I will reiterate this. You make sure you are doing the tasks and having the headings as your tasks which you complete. That may be different for task 2 where you need to do a literature review, but task 3 and task 1 is where you need to have the headings, and it needs to be the same wording, please. So a summary of what you need to do. Again, make sure you start with an introduction and end with a conclusion. Introduce the area. It's so important you introduce the area and identify what you will be doing at the start of it. Make sure you have a contents page so it identifies where the work is, and you number your pages as well. And if you stick to that structure, that will help you for all your assignments. Avoid using things like bullet points because it's an academic piece of work. Okay, so do not bullet point your work. Make sure it's an academic piece of work. Make sure you are sticking to what the feedback form says in regards to what you are expected to do for each learning outcome, and make sure you are completing the assessment criteria as well. Make sure, again, I will reiterate this, which I've gone through once before, make sure you are using Harvard system for referencing. You can refer to online sites that may help you, such as Neil's Toolbox. There's other sites, Cite Me. There's lots of other sites that you can use that would help you. If you're using diagrams, please make sure you reference them accordingly. Make sure you are referencing them properly so you're able to identify that. Make sure you have a bibliography reference list, and it is in alphabetical order. One thing I've realized is that individuals are using the Harvard system of referencing, but when they're using that, they are not referencing things in alphabetical order. So that might be something that you need to bear in mind when referencing. Make sure when you access things from the internet that you are putting the date that it's been accessed in brackets, so it identifies you are using the Harvard system of referencing. So it needs to be in alphabetical order. Tries to use more examples when explaining certain concepts. For example, when looking at theories, when looking at case law, make sure you are using examples to identify that you are trying to implement a certain concept, and you use an example to identify that this is that concept. Make sure you are using the assessment criteria, as I've mentioned, as a heading for each part of the task. For example, if you are looking at task 1 and looking at assessment criteria 1.1, each part of the task should be done as a heading and answered under that heading. And it's really important, that is very important, that you have a heading for each element of the task so that the person is able to identify that you've completed each part of the task and use the wording that is in the task rather than using the wording that you want to use. So it's really important that you use the same wording. Again, you need to be referring to your indicative context all the time and checking the word count. The word count is really important because you have a 10-way leeway either way. So make sure you're not going too much over or too much below as well. Useful tips. Read the task carefully, focus on the details, focus on what the task is asking you rather than what you think it's asking you, because you have a restricted word limit. You need to, abide by that word limit. Command words, just as guidance, command words that you can cover things like explain, define, describe, 70 to 100 words, assess, examine, clarify, 100 to 125 words, compare, contrast, critically evaluate, 150 to 200 words. Again, going back to referencing and why referencing is so important, referencing needs to be Harvard. So in the main text, the author and date and style. So for example, Slack, Johnston, Brandon Jones, 2011. So that's in the main text of your assignment. In the reference towards the end, it comes as shown as Slack, Johnston, Brandon, 2011. The book name, the publisher, the place it was published, and the edition would go in that. Word limits, again, we reiterate 10% leeway. Make sure your document looks presentable and professional. And the word limit on this one is 2,500 plus 1,000 plus 500, so 4,000 it is 10%. Plagiarism or tolerance similarity must be below 20%. And I will identify the importance of plagiarism again, how it's important, because you've signed a declaration. If you've signed that declaration, it identifies that it's your work and it's not being copied from anywhere else. So you need to make sure your similarity must be below 20% to avoid any sort of collusion, any sort of plagiarism or cheating. And you need to make sure that it is below 20%. And you've referenced all your work because, you know, it will identify that. You need to make sure, again, and I will reiterate this again and again and again, you are not copying and pasting work, as it's plagiarism and would lead to academic misconduct. Make sure you reference all your sources. Make sure you check the grammar and spelling as well, because avoid using American style. If it's organization, use the S instead of the Z. And check your grammar, check your punctuation, check how you write as well. Avoid using bullet points. It needs to be an academic piece of work that's structured and flowed well. Refer to ebooks and journals on Moodle for this unit and any sort of additional reading. If there's any sort of additional reading on Moodle, please refer to that as well. Any queries or questions, kindly email learnerwork@ukvarsity.co.uk. Any questions you have, anything about how to structure anything or anything about how to do the assignment, or if you're stuck somewhere, anything, please email learnerwork@ukvarsity.co.uk. Submission of the assignment must be done on learnerwork@ukvarsity.co.uk, and submission is after 2 weeks of completion of the unit and its delivery. So now that the legal research method unit is completed, you are able to start doing the assignment and start preparing it to submit within 2 weeks, okay? Again, reiterate, make sure you are referencing your work and there's no forms of plagiarism. Make sure you are reading what the tasks are asking you. This is an overall summary of the session. Make sure you are checking your spelling and grammar. Make sure you are not copying and pasting, which I've mentioned. Make sure you are using Harvard references system. Make sure you are clearly identifying what tasks you are doing, what part of the task, as the tasks need to be the heading. Make sure you are sticking to the policy and procedures of OTHM. And if you have any questions, again, refer to Moodle, but also questions or any sort of submissions, learnerwork@ukvarsity.co.uk. So this is the end of the assignment discussion session, and thank you for attending the session and good luck with getting on with your assignment. Thank you.